Russians being killed for taking a small village or a city in Ukraine, the costs are extremely high. And that is what I think makes Putin and Russia so dangerous. I don't know of any other country where the leadership is ready to send so many of their own people into death just to advance a little bit on the front lines. That is, I think, more important to see this as the threat and not the number of tanks that Russia is producing or the number of missiles they are making. I think that is the real threat that comes from Russia.
Hello and welcome to Independence Avenue Media. I'm your host, Iya Meur-Michele, and I have the pleasure of speaking with Nico Lange today. We'll be talking about Ukraine, providing arms to Ukraine, NATO's role in this process, and other things related to war in Ukraine. Nico is a non-resident fellow with the Transatlantic Defense and Security Program at the Center for European Policy Analysis. It's a think tank based in Washington, D.C., and he's also a senior fellow at the Munich Security Conference in Berlin and Munich. Nico, hello, and welcome to Independence Avenue Media. I really appreciate you being here today.
Thank you for having me.
About a week ago, President Trump announced that Ukraine basically can have unlimited amounts of weapons as long as the NATO allies or individual NATO countries would buy it. What do you think this means? Do you think we're seeing some sort of change of heart from Donald Trump towards Ukraine?
Well, first of all, it's good news for people in Ukrainian cities that at least Patriot systems and Patriot missiles can be bought. Also missiles for drone defense systems, for short-range air defense, because those Russian air attacks on Ukrainian cities, including Kiev, have been really terrible with a lot of civilian victims. So it's good news, but it's also the second best option. I mean, the best option would be if the US would not only declare, but really show a real interest in helping Ukraine, putting also military pressure on the Russian side. That's the only way that could lead to meaningful negotiations. And Trump does not seem to be willing to do that. But the second best option, and that this has been discussed for a while, would be that Ukraine would get the US capabilities, the US weapons and ammunition that the Europeans are not producing, but the Europeans would pay for it. So I'm glad that it worked out this way. And Germany is taking a lead here. And I think Friedrich Merz's relation to Trump helped in making that possible. And now the question is, what kind of weapons will there be except air defense? It's not really clear yet, but it seems there is a bigger package that certainly will help Ukraine in the military on the military side, not only to sustain, but maybe to put pressure on Russia. And the last thing I want to mention is, the open question is, will Trump pressure Putin at least in the energy sector during those 50 days that he has now set, or will nothing happen in the 50 days? Because if nothing happens, I don't think Putin will agree to something just because 50 days have passed.
Are you saying that we'll need to see what happens after 50 days? You don't have any expectations that Putin will change his actions before that?
Well, the most important thing is what happens within the 50 days. Will there be military pressure on Putin? Will there be pressure on energy with not having the shadow fleet calling to ports, with maybe the oil price going further down? There's now a new sanctions package from the European Union. Will this have consequences with the oil price cap? I mean, if pressure is built up during the 50 days, then Putin will do nothing. But if no pressure is built up, why should he agree to something in 50 days?
Do you think India and China are taking this 50 days seriously, at least as President Trump wants them to do?
It's difficult to judge because President Trump had already a couple of ultimatums, and they always changed into something else. They transformed. Also, the taxes that were announced, they later morphed into something else. So maybe everybody is just waiting for Trump. Is he really pushing this through, or is he making up new announcements or setting new conditions out? India and China are not the only buyers of Russian oil and gas. I mean, they are affected by this, but it's also the Slovak Republic, Hungary, Italy. So countries in Europe that have the reputation, or their leaders have the reputation of being friends with Trump. Will Trump really follow through and impose sanctions on them? So yeah, there are many open questions when it comes to this. But I don't think that Putin or Xi Jinping or Modi do have sleepless nights because of this.
This is the last question about this 50 days. Do you think 50 days is enough for some of these countries, including some of the European countries, to rearrange their energy needs and completely stop buying Russian oil and gas and pivot to something else, possibly maybe US LNG or US energy resources?
For many countries in Europe, this was a clear path also without this. And I mean, Germany just before this announced that Germany will buy more American LNG. And the European Union made an announcement that they have now a decision to completely disallow buying of any Russian energy resources within the territory of the European Union from 2027. So there is this route anyway. The more important question will be, will this disengage China and India from Russia, or will they find a way around this? Because this is where Putin, I think, gets the larger part of the revenues now. But it's also a question to the Europeans. I mean, India, for example, is refining Russian oil, and then the fuel is bought by Europeans. So if we are serious about this, we should also not buy this fuel from India anymore. So there are open questions around this, pressure points, certainly. But coming back to the initial question, I mean, Putin will look at all this, at India, at China, at the European Union, at Trump, and wait it out and see if they are really doing the necessary steps that would in the end pressure him. And then he can decide whether he has to react or not. So he seems very relaxed about this. Putin does not seem to trust for everybody to follow through on this.
Yeah, we'll see what happens. September 2nd will come soon enough, I guess. But what would you say about what's happening on the front lines now? Are we seeing some of these weapons already making their way, or is it too early to say?
Weapons from this was what currently has been agreed certainly are not seen at the front lines yet.
And you said that we don't know what it consists of, but there are some reports, not unconfirmed or not official reports, that this package could also include JASSMs.
It would be great to have standoff weapons with higher ranges. Ukraine needs that to put pressure on Russia. It would then depend on which exact type of JASSMs it would be, because the range varies depending on the type. We will see. We will only find out if they are used in the battlefield. I mean, and it's also a good approach not to tell the other side what exactly you are delivering. They will find out when the weapons are used on the battlefield. It seems to me Russia is not really doing well with the offensive they started a couple of weeks ago, but they are drawing the conclusion that they have to even do more of the same. And they are slowly advancing around Pokrovsk, and they are slowly advancing around Konstantinivka. So we will see those cities being under pressure, and probably if this continues for a couple of months, those cities, both in Donbass, being flattened, as we have seen with other cities before. But this is very far from the strategic successes that Putin wanted to have, going into Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, going after the city of Sumy, taking Luhansk and Donetsk Oblast fully, or even talking about Odessa. Putin is absolutely far away from reaching any of those goals.
I know that you go and talk to the Ukrainians both on the front lines and are very closely informed about what's happening. Do you think this Monday's announcement had some sort of impact on morale of the troops?
The situation on the front lines is bad enough, but people I met there, they are very tough. And they are not on the front lines for the first day, so they know how to handle the tough situation. But what bothers them is if the cities are not protected, where their families live, their relatives live. So the air defense for Kiev and other big cities in Ukraine is something that is also important for soldiers on the front lines. And some of them are even saying, look, we need equipment, we need weapons, ammunition on the front lines, but it's even more important to protect our families at home. That's I think, a very important element to understand when talking about Patriot systems and Patriot missiles.
Now, I have a bit of a technical question for you. President Trump said that Ukraine will be getting possibly 17 Patriots, possibly less. What does that mean when you hear that, to you at least? Is it Patriot systems? Is it 17 batteries? So what could he be talking about?
It's difficult to follow all the communications around those Patriot systems, and sometimes people on the very top, and maybe they don't have to be, are not filled in on all the little details of all this. I think what President Trump was referring to might be the total number of Patriot systems that will be in Ukraine after the end of the process. There have been Patriot systems already donated to Ukraine. They are American produced, but they have been donated by countries such as Germany or Norway or the Netherlands or others who had them in their possession and then delivered them to Ukraine. So only the new ones, the newly produced that now Germany and other countries are paying for, they are directly coming from the US. If Ukraine has a number of systems in the end that goes into that direction, then it is good to cover more territory of Ukraine. Ukraine is a big country. You need a number of air defense systems to produce relative safety. The key question, though, is what about the missiles, the ammunition for the air defense system? There is a shortage of air defense missiles. And the Patriot, the PAC-3, that's the name of the missiles, they are slowly produced. Everybody wants to have them. There is shortage. So the question for Ukraine increasingly seems to be not about how many Patriot systems do we have, but about how many Patriot missiles do we have. The Europeans are starting their own production of Patriot missiles, but this will not produce results until sometime in 2026. So there is a gap between now and then, and that's most important for Ukraine now, how to get your hands on Patriot missiles. And there's another truth I think that we have to mention here. Patriot missiles are very useful against ballistic missiles and aeroballistic missiles, where you have a short warning time and you can shoot them down. That's what makes the system so valuable. But against the hundreds of drones that we see every night going to Ukrainian cities, it's not a good idea to use the expensive Patriot missiles. You need other means for that.
And is there any movement in that direction to develop a system? Again, it's been reported, at least on in the media environment, that Ukraine is developing something, I believe together with Germany, that will be very impactful against Shahed drones.
Yeah, in order to counter hundreds of drones, you need a multi-layered air defense. There is not a single system that you can use to shoot down all the drones. There are different systems you need. Ukraine is making good progress in bringing many of those drones down by warfare in the electromagnetic spectrum. That's jamming and spoofing. I think we can support Ukraine with that. Jamming the satellite navigation from the Russian side, the GLONASS system, is very helpful to counter those drones. There are short-range air defense systems. Some of them are from the US, some of them from other countries where you need ammunition that can help. We have a German air defense tank that is quite good in bringing down those drones. There are other rapid-fire guns that can help. So you need a mix of weapons to bring many of those drones down. Ukraine is experimenting with drone-to-drone combat. So you have hunting drones, bringing those Shahid drones down, but so far, I think electronic warfare is the most promising way of bringing those drones down. But we have to see, in order to really get to the bottom of the problem, you need deep strike precision fires and just take out the drone factories. That is much more efficient than to try to defend against thousands of drones. That's why the question whether there are, for example, JASSM missiles in the package from the US is so important.
Russia basically bribing its own citizens to go fight, which of course is not the case with the Ukrainians. And the numbers that they are losing on the battlefield are just staggering, incredible. So do you think Russia can sustain this? Whatever Putin is doing this, is he going to have enough people to sustain this summer offensive at the level that you mentioned he wants to sustain it?
Putin found an equilibrium after experimenting with mobilization, also with mobilization that I think went the wrong way and produced a lot of negative discussions in Russia. The equilibrium he found is offering a lot of money to soldiers who go fighting, and the amounts of money in if you compare this to Russian salaries are so high that even the families are pressuring them. You have to go. We can all live for a long time from this salary. And it seems as long as Putin has the money, he is able to send soldiers to the front lines, and he doesn't seem to care very much that he loses 800 or 1,000 a day to injury and even getting killed. The way the Russians are fighting is very primitive, and the progress is very slow, and that means the cost when it comes to the human costs of this, Russians being killed for taking a small village or a city in Ukraine, the costs are extremely high. And that is what I think makes Putin and Russia so dangerous. I don't know of any other country where the leadership is ready to send so many of their own people into death just to advance a little bit on the front lines. That is, I think, more important to see this as the threat and not the number of tanks that Russia is producing or the number of missiles they are making. I think that is the real threat that comes from Russia. It's a way of fighting that I think Ukraine cannot fight like that. We could not fight like that. That is, I think, something that should at least lead us to the conclusion we need to give Ukraine the instruments to transform the warfare into another way of fighting and not going into this Russian way of fighting that is absolutely not valuing human life.
When we talk about transferring weapons to Ukraine from from NATO allies, why are countries so reluctant to give up some of the weapons and provide more help to Ukraine? Like, for example, give all the Patriot missiles that countries have deep inside Europe. Let's say Germany, for example, right? Is Germany expecting Russia to send rockets to Germany?
Well, you could add the question, why on earth was it not possible within 3 years to ramp up the production?
Or that, yes.
Yeah, why were the decisions not made to produce more? Then the problem would be less of a problem. I think there are certain elements to this. One of the elements is that many decision makers, not all of them, but many of them, are still in a mental prison. And the mental prison is derived from the first days of the war, where many decision makers thought it's over. Ukraine will lose, Russia will win, Russia will take control over Ukraine. And within the system of military and decision making on the political level, many people did not move out of that mental prison. They still believe that we can help Ukraine a little, but in the end, Russia will win. I think that's absolutely wrong. Ukraine has demonstrated that the opposite is true, but it's still a guideline for decision making for many. And of course, it doesn't help, because then you arrive, yes, we help a little bit, but we preserve everything else for ourselves, because it's hopeless with Ukraine anyway, and we have to be prepared for the later stage where it might be about us. So coming out of that mental prison seems to be important. The Scandinavians already, from the very beginning, have a totally different mindset. Many Central Eastern Europeans have. The Ukrainians certainly know that you can beat Russia, but it's more important that the big European nations and the US come out of that mental prison, because it's a recipe for a long war where Ukraine has to bear the costs for the long war. And the second element in this is, I believe, the Europeans are reluctant to have ownership, especially Germany, because the security from a German point of view for the last decades worked in a way somebody else is solving our security questions on the European continent. And the decision the Germans have to take is whether they take part or not take part, or they comment from the sidelines. But the Europeans having ownership for their own security, not only by committing to a certain percentage of spending of their GDP like they did in The Hague, but really making the important decisions on how to push Putin back to peace, how to preserve peace after a possible ceasefire, that seems to develop only with very hard reluctance. But it's puzzling, because it's obvious. It must be the Europeans who push Putin back to peace. That's exactly the question he is asking. The Trump administration will not do this for the Europeans. And if they are not doing this themselves, it will get worse, and it will be more expensive and more difficult to fight Putin later. So it's puzzling to me, and I'm certainly trying to convince that this decision has to be made. It's, by the way, an irony that the only person expressing this clearly this year at the Munich Security Conference was President Zelensky, who made the point that you cannot really make a difference between European security and security of Ukraine. It's the same thing. But it seems to me that in the German political elites, there is a difference between securing Ukraine or bringing peace back to Ukraine and European security, so that European security starts, I don't know, somewhere west of Ukraine. And I think that's the strategic mistake.
During the Biden administration, Washington tried very hard not to include NATO in this. In any way, we have, of course, the Ramstein format, which is NATO members plus others. Over 50 countries are participating in it, and it was always under the U.S. leadership. So NATO did not have a specific role. Now, with President Trump's announcement, and with Secretary General Rutte being in Washington when Trump made that announcement, it elevates NATO's role. At least that's the perception that was created with this. Plus, NATO will coordinate, as I understand, the transportation of the weapons. Do you think this will change this attitude that you just talked about, having NATO pretty much directly involved in coordinating, providing this assistance to Ukraine, or does it not matter?
Well, first of all, I believe the Biden policy was wrong on this. This whole idea, we don't mention NATO, keep NATO out of this, don't make it look like NATO is doing something. What was this good for? I mean, in Russian media, even in Putin's words, the Russians were telling that they are fighting NATO all the way from the very beginning. So what was the point of doing this? I do not understand. Many opportunities were missed, I think, by having this kind of approach oh, let's make it look like NATO is not involved on this. So that was clearly not a good policy by the Biden administration, and by extension, because, for example, the German government then was just one-to-one following everything that was coming from the Biden White House. Also, the Scholz government had the wrong policy on this. And others were more forward-leaning, and I think they were right. And I think we have to say this now. It's better to have NATO as the clearinghouse for military capabilities that go to Ukraine. It's better to have NATO involved also when it comes to intelligence, surveillance, support of the Ukrainians with many things they need. But it's for the Europeans in NATO to step up on this. But of course, I mean, that's the institution we use for European security. Why should we not use it for the biggest security problem in Europe we have? Doesn't make sense. And NATO, with everything that NATO does in Europe, it prepares for defense and deterrence against the same Russia that is attacking Ukraine. I mean, it's the same adversary. So I think it's good that NATO is involved. I think NATO should be involved more. And if you see what concretely should be done, I think NATO should be involved in Ukrainian air defense by using capabilities on the eastern border of NATO and European Union to shoot down Russian missiles and drones over Ukrainian airspace, if you can reach them, and by helping Ukraine with capabilities to bring down the drones that are coming in thousands. That would be a good next step for especially the Europeans in NATO to get involved within the NATO framework.
Do you think allies are sort of getting closer to making that decision or thinking in that direction? Can we see integrated NATO-Ukraine air defense system at some point?
Well, I'm bringing it up. Others are bringing it up. My experience during the last 3.5 years is that political decision makers sometimes need help with ideas and also with a little bit of public push for ideas because they are so reluctant in doing something. But I think this touches very much in Europe the question of who we are as European nations. Are we European nations watching how families are getting killed in their sleep by missiles and drones? Is that what we want to be? We just had the sad anniversary of the Srebrenica massacre, and we're commemorating it in Europe. I remember very well, and I was on missions myself on the Balkans twice. I remember very well how we told everybody, oh, we will not do this again. We will not be indifferent again to something like this happening on the European continent. We will be different as Europeans. We will interfere. We will protect human lives on the European continent. So many years after that, I mean, I think it touches a core question of not only security, but also of European identity, who we want to be. And I cannot just accept that we say, oh, there's nothing we can do, and the families are getting killed in Kiev or Odessa or Lviv. Or we make this kind of wishy-washy statement that does not really mean anything and certainly does not change anything for Putin. So there needs to be a public push for doing the right thing.
Nico, thank you very much for your time and for your thoughts. I really appreciate this.
Thank you for the invitation.